Right, here we are for this week's masterclass session. It's really exciting because Anna's actually already added quite a lot of value to the sales confidence community. She's joined our first member dinner, which was really cool. And so I'm really excited to have her actually leading this session on. She's going to be covering another areas, but I guess the overall focus is how you can read people, influence, persuade, and kind of motivate those that are around you. So she's going to be covering things like how to motivate people to buy and sell, talking about the importance of body language hacks for you as a salesperson or a sales leader, and then also how to build a strong leadership presence and truly have a strong impact. So one of the cool things that I like about Anna, she's kind of done multiple roles at different stages of her career, but she's dedicated herself to coaching and developing people. So over the last few years, she's worked with dozens of sales leaders and lots of individual contributors to increase performance and increase their leadership presence, as well as managing teams. She's also implemented coaching as part of her day. So looking forward to today's session. And obviously, if you're watching this back from a recording, feel free to comment in the recording section, and we can get other questions answered that weren't necessarily covered in the session today.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm very excited to be here. To set the scene a bit, if you hear a dog barking, that is because we have a dog in the office today, which I find very exciting. But yeah, he's making some sounds. That being said, I'm going to share my screen now. And as James already said, we are going to talk about how to read people. And I hope you can see the screen now. If not, give me a shout. So basically what we want to talk about today is reading people, but also how we can read people and then use that information to build our own influence. And to be more precise, we're going to cover 3 different areas. So number 1 is really how we can motivate others, how we can identify what motivates others, and how we can use that both in the sales process, but also as we are leading teams, as we are leading people, to make sure motivation is high and people are motivated to either sell stuff, if we're leading people, or to buy the things we are trying to sell. Then the second area we are going to cover is body language. So really the message behind the words that are being said. Body language is very, very powerful. And especially in sales, I'm always surprised how much of a difference body language training can make, because prospects tell you what they want if you just pay attention. And the same goes for when you lead people. People will tell you what they need. You just need to watch carefully. You need to listen carefully. And then the third area we are going to cover today is really all about leadership presence. So what it is that you need to become a successful leader. And I also want to be really clear here. Leadership does not always mean managing people. Leadership is really about showing up as a leader. And there's also a lot of similarities between a sales cycle and leadership skills, because at the end of the day, it's all about people. And if you nail the people skills, you're going to be successful both in a sales cycle, but also in a leadership position. But first things first, James already did an introduction. I also want to introduce myself. As James said, I'm a sales training manager at a tech startup here in London called Vitamojo. I'm also an ICF certified coach. So over the last few years, I've worked with sales professionals. I've worked with them on areas like improving their leadership presence, communication skills, body language, all the things we're going to talk about today. But I also work with sales teams on getting them closer together, making sure they really collaborate in a way that is effective for them. And I also worked a lot with people who went from individual contributor to first-time manager. That was or is one of the areas I specialize in quite heavily, because I've been there and I know it can be quite difficult to go from IC to first-time manager. And I think there's a lack of support in that area. So I want to make sure that everyone is well prepared when they go through that transition. My background is also in sales. So I worked in tech startups in Berlin, in London. I had the privilege to work for a unicorn and to also lead teams across EMEA. And that's also where I got interested in coaching, because I've always been asking myself the question, why is it that some people are more successful than others? And that's a question we're going to focus on today as well, because there is a formula to success and there are things that we can do to be more successful. And that being said, let's jump right in. So the first topic I want to talk about is really motivation. Motivation is key, because without motivation, we're not going to do anything. We are not going to buy stuff. We're not going to sell stuff. We're not going to show up to work. So it's important for us, as we talk about reading people, to really understand what motivates people. Why do people do stuff? That's the main question. And to spoil, there are two main motivators for people. One is pleasure, one is pain. Now, let's focus on pleasure first. Pleasure can be a great motivator. For example, let's say it's the 1st of January and everyone has that New Year's resolution that they want to look really fit, they want to be really healthy, they dream of that lifestyle, and that's why they hit the gym. That is motivation through pleasure, because we have that vision. Same goes in a sales cycle, for example. You might be telling your prospect, once they start using your solution, they might have smoother processes, they might spend less time doing admin work, whatever your USPs are and your selling points are. So pleasure is great to motivate people. However, something we have to keep in mind is that pain is even stronger. At average, it's like 2.5 times stronger than pleasure when it comes to motivating people. Motivating through pain is an interesting one, because I think we've all been there. We've all been motivated by pain. For example, let's say someone is facing health issues and suddenly they change the way they eat, they change the way they work out because they want to feel better. Or someone is scared that they are not hitting the target, so they work even harder to make sure they hit the target and they are not risking their job. So pain can be a really good motivator. However, as we go through a sales cycle, as we lead people, we still want to make sure they feel safe. So we need to use pain very carefully. A good example of using pain could be that as you speak to people in a sales process, that you really point out, okay, this is where your process is not going well. This is where you lose so many hours working. That's where you need more staff because your processes are not working smoothly. That's pointing out pain in a good way. We don't want to demotivate them either. So use that very carefully. And something that I think is also really important when we talk about motivation and pleasure and pain is that when you're selling to a group of people, which realistically will happen because you have the decision maker, you have the person that is promoting you, you have other people who are influencers, we need to realize that each one of those people have their own pleasure and pain points. So that one person might be talking to you because they want to impress their boss and they want to be the person that brought in this really great solution that made everyone's lives easier. Or the other person might be talking to you because they actually want to save money. The next person wants to leave work earlier and wants to go home earlier, and that's why they want to make sure they are saving time. So each person you talk to has their own motivation behind the fact that they are talking to you, and that's what you are trying to identify as the salesperson. And same in leadership, it's very important to figure out why people are actually in the role in the first place. how do we do that? We do that through listening. And I know listening sounds like a very basic skill, but you would be surprised how many people get it wrong. And that's why I want to talk to you about the 3 levels of listening. So the first level of listening is subjective listening. And that's, to be honest, the worst kind of listening you can do. Subjective listening is where someone says something and suddenly you turn it around and you make it all about yourself. So very basic example here. Person A says, I had the toughest time getting up 30 minutes earlier this morning. And your reply is, you just have to force yourself. If I have something to do that I don't want to do, I just make myself do it anyway. Great. So how do you think the other person is feeling in that situation? Probably not great, because they tried to communicate something to you and you just made it all about yourself. They don't feel like you are actually listening. The second kind of listening is objective listening. It's already a bit better, but at the same time, it's still not perfect, because objective listening can seem quite forced. So that's where you really make it all about the other person. So quite the opposite of subjective listening. So again, same example. Person A says, I had the toughest time getting up 30 minutes earlier this morning. And then you say, you had a struggle and you still did it. Congratulations. That sounds very robotic. Sometimes it sounds like the other person is trying to make fun of you. So also when we use that kind of listening, let's just be careful with it. The best kind of listening we can do is intuitive listening. And that's where we really listen for what's said behind the words that are coming out of someone else's mouth. So what is the real message behind it? And that really requires us putting in an effort and being curious. So same example, person A says, I had the toughest time getting up 30 minutes earlier this morning. And then you, person B, says, it sounds like you really wanted to do this, but you're exhausted and you found that makes sense that it seemed really challenging for you. So what we're trying to do is we want to show the other person. First, we want to acknowledge. So we want to acknowledge what's being said, but then we also want to validate. So that's why we're saying it makes sense that you're exhausted. It makes sense that you feel challenged. And that's actually a really good technique when you are talking to a prospect or negotiating, for example. Totally off topic, but there's a study that is quite interesting. So when hostage negotiators talk to hostage takers, they usually name the emotion. So they say it makes perfect sense that you don't want to come out because you're scared, or it's scary, or the thought of going to prison is scary. The reason they do that is because once we label an emotion, it becomes less powerful. And the same is in the sales cycle. The same is when you lead people. If you have someone who is really skeptical, you can say, hey, it makes sense that you're skeptical. It makes sense that this seems like a scary situation because you don't want to make the wrong decision. Doing that takes away the fear. And then once the fear is taken away, people are more open to negotiate, to talk to you, and to also listen to you. So acknowledging and validating what's being said can be a really powerful tool. Same when you start managing people. And let's say you have someone who might not be doing what you asked them to do. Really listen to them and try to find out the reason. And then you can say, hey, it's totally understandable that you struggled with this because you felt like you're not in a position where you can really do this properly yet. Let's have a look at it. So just really pay attention to that level 3 listening. I'm quickly going to check if there are any questions so far. No. By the way, if you have any questions, feel free to add them in the chat. I try to check the chat regularly. And then going back to motivation, this is actually an exercise I do with all of my clients. So when we talk motivation, there are some motivators that are quite common, which you can see here. So this is actually something I want you to use. So make sure that you save that slide, that you have it somewhere accessible. And what we want to do when we want to find out what is someone's motivator is we really want to ask ourselves, okay, are they motivated by money? Are they motivated by recognition? Usually there's a primary and a secondary motivator. So someone might be really motivated by money, but they're also motivated by their career growth. And this is particularly useful when you manage people. So when, for example, with my clients, when they have a one-on-one, I always want them to have this on their one-on-one sheet to remember, okay, this person is actually really motivated by helping others. When I delegate tasks to them, I want to make sure they involve helping others. That's how we keep the person engaged. That's how we keep the person motivated. But the same is in a sales cycle. When you're talking to, let's say, the finance director of a company, and they are very focused on money, okay, then you might want to phrase things in a way where you emphasize that they can actually save money by using your product. So knowing those motivators can get you a lot further. And I would even recommend to really sit down and write down, or even add a P for primary and S for secondary in those boxes for each of the people that are reporting to you. And if you don't have direct reports and you are in a sales cycle that is already a bit more advanced, then you can do that exercise with your prospects as well. Not with your prospects, you're thinking about your prospects and you figure it out for them. But it's not just about us listening well. It's not just about us saying the right things and figuring out motivators. It's also about how we show up and how we read other people's body language. Because nonverbal signals account for 65 to 90% of our total communication, which is crazy. So people already have an opinion about you before you even open your mouth. And what I find really interesting is that applies to the physical world. It also applies to the online world. So we are also going to talk about how you can update your online presence in a few minutes. But first, I want to show you or talk about the 3 core concepts to remember when we talk about body language. So the first concept is that body language is instinctive. As much as we are trying to control it, there are some things we just can't control, especially when it comes to facial expressions or reactions to what's being said. So that's why learning how to read body language can be so powerful, because people will tell you the truth. People will give it away if they are skeptical. People will give it away when they feel like you're selling them a great solution. It's once you nail that skill, your life as a salesperson and as a sales leader will get a lot easier. Body language can also change hormone levels. That's how powerful it is. So body language can help us to release oxytocin, dopamine, even testosterone, just because of the way we stand, we sit. So keeping that in mind can be really helpful, because the way someone moves is also how they phrase their feeling or their thoughts and what feelings might come up for them. And then the concept number 3 is the more you practice, the better you'll get. That's something that is the core of learning how to read people, really. You need to keep practicing. As I said, body language is quite instinctive, but there's still some things that we can control and that will help us to seem a bit more powerful. But because body language is something that is quite instinctive and that is just something that has been there for as long as humans exist, it's also very natural. And that's where there is also some gender-specific body language. I want to give you some tips here that are really relevant, especially in the sales world. So for the ladies in the group, there is something that we don't want to do, especially we don't want to do that in a sales cycle. We don't want to do that when we are in a negotiation situation, for example. And that's something we don't want to do, is we don't want to expose our wrists. Now, exposing our wrists means really to have our wrist facing upwards or to expose it to the room. And the reason for that is because we release pheromones here and it is quite a submissive gesture. So especially when you have men in the group, it's just a really submissive gesture and it undermines your credibility, and that's why I would recommend to just, if you can control it, don't stand like this. Also, something that is very important, especially for women, is holding our head still. We tend to nod a lot. Men do that as well, but statistically, women do it more often. Now, don't get me wrong, nodding can be really powerful. For example, if you have someone who won't shut up and you just want them to stop talking, when you nod fast, it will get them to speed up and stop talking eventually. It also works the other way around. If you have someone who might not be that easy to open up to other people, who is quite hesitant, who is not a big talker, then you want to nod slowly, because that signals to them, okay, keep talking, I'm listening. But those gestures can only be powerful if you're not nodding nonstop. So make sure your head is still when you're not nodding. And then something else we want to be really mindful of is crossing our ankles. Now that can be when we are sitting underneath the chair, but it can also be when we are standing. So when someone is crossing their legs when they're standing, it's probably one of the worst things you can do for your confidence, because you will feel less confident and you will seem less confident. Now, it's okay to cross your legs when you're sitting, but make sure that there's always one foot that is firmly planted to the floor. That's very important. Now, moving on to the men in the group, there's also some things that make sense for men to be mindful of. Men in general should be a bit careful with dominant posture, so that meaning that you take up a lot of space. I mean, mansplaining seems to be a thing. There's even a term for it now. But what we're really trying to say here is that dominant posture can lead, especially to the women in the group, to close up. So if you're talking to a group of people, you're a man, and you see that all the women in the group suddenly start crossing their arms, then that is not a good sign. That means that you want to go back to building rapport. That means that they don't feel great in this group at the moment. So just be mindful of this. And also, touch is something that can be really powerful, especially when it comes to handshakes. Like, one handshake is as powerful as 3 hours of communication. That's how powerful touch is. So it's a great tool we can use, especially when you're at a trade show, for example. Shake people's hands. It makes a huge difference. But be very mindful of where you touch people. The elbow is, in general, a really safe area to touch people. What I would always recommend to avoid, in general, is touching people on the shoulders or even patting them on the back. It's a very patronizing gesture, and the person being patted on the back will not feel great. Cool. Just checking the chat. Okay, no questions so far. And if you're ever unsure what someone is trying to tell you, if you're ever unsure what someone's body language means, there's a very simple rule. And that rule is just mimic them. If they're standing a certain way and you're not quite sure what that means, just take on the exact same posture. And that's why body language is so brilliant, because when we move a certain way, we will feel a certain way. So you mimicking their body language will also help you understanding them. And fact on the side, it's also like, I'm sure most of you have probably heard of it. It's also a very effective sales tool. It's called mirroring. And the reason why mirroring is so great, so for those of you who don't know, mirroring means basically I'm mimicking the other person's body language, and I'm doing that because it helps us build trust. It helps us feel closer to that person. It might feel very odd when we do it, but the thing is, first, most of the time, we don't even realize we're doing it. And secondly, it can really set you apart from other salespeople, especially when it comes to building rapport, building that relationship. And just pay attention to it when you're around your friends, for example. Chances are when you're in a group of friends or when you're talking one-on-one to a friend, you're already doing it. It's something we, again, do quite instinctively, but that's also the reason why it helps us build trust, because when we are feeling close to someone, we are doing it. So try to mimic other people's body language to understand how they feel, what they might be thinking, but also to help you build trust with the other person. Now, since all of us are salespeople, I want to also talk about a few things that we should know as salespeople. And I have a question for you here. So feel free to use the chat. Who do you think in this picture, in this group, who is the leader? You have 5 seconds to guess. If not, I'm going to give it away. Okay. So the leader is this person here. Why? Let's talk about seating orders first. So when it comes to meeting room tables, or most of them are square or rectangular, some of them are round, so it really depends on the table shape as well. But in general, the person sitting here in this space where the gentleman with the tie is sitting, that's where the leader sits. Why? Because the leader wants to be in a position where they can see the full room and where they are opposite the door. So no one wants to be the person that is facing the door with their back, just because it makes us feel really unsafe and vulnerable. Then the other two people right next to the leader are the people who have the most influence on them. So if you are selling to this group of people, you want to pay attention to that area of the table. And the further down we go, the lower the influence will be, the lower the involvement in the meeting will be. The only exception is the person opposite the leader. Now, this is a great space for you to be in as the salesperson, because being opposite the leader makes it quite easy to establish eye contact with them. And usually the person facing or opposite the leader is also the person that is one of the most engaged people in the room. Now, another reason why we can spot that one person is the leader is because non-alphas are usually looking towards the alpha. And fun fact on the side, it's not just where we look, it's also where our feet point. So if you're ever unsure who might be the leader in the room, just look at people's feet. Chances are they are pointing towards the leader. The only exception is if all feet are pointing somewhere else, it might mean something else, because we're also pointing our feet towards our crush. So there might also be some romances going on. But in general, if everyone has their feet pointed at the same person, chances are that person is the leader. That's who you want to talk to. Then in general, in sales, what we don't want to do is we don't want to stand above people. Now, don't get me wrong, when you're doing a presentation, it's fine. As soon as you get to the Q&A part, it makes sense for you to get on their level. So to sit down, for example. Because when we stand above someone, it basically makes the person that is below us feel more defensive, and it's very, very difficult to build trust in that scenario. We also always want to make sure that we are showing our hands. Why? Because our hands are our most deadly weapons. I mean, we used to kill with our hands. We used to do everything with our hands. But that's why we also, our brains, are constantly scanning people for their hands. And that's why if you have your hands in your pocket, if you have your hands behind your back, it will be really difficult for you and the other person to build trust, because the other person feels like you're hiding something. So make sure your hands are visible. And that also applies to a virtual world. But I'm going to talk about this in a minute. Just keep in mind, showing your hands, having good hand gestures can really help you build rapport with your prospects, with your team. A small add-on here for negotiations, since negotiations are a big part of doing sales, whether that means you want to book a meeting, you want to close a deal, you want to negotiate for a better salary. there's a few things we need to consider, especially when we do negotiations face-to-face. So we ideally want to do them face-to-face because that's where we will be more successful with negotiations. Negotiations are something very personal. Emotions might come up, so we want to do it in person. Never, ever negotiate over a meal. If you invite your prospects to a meeting or to a dinner, don't use this to negotiate contract terms. Really just focus on building relationships. We are horrible at negotiating while having food. Why? Because when we have food, first, we feel really vulnerable. Secondly, because our body is processing the food. So the energy we have goes towards processing the food and digesting the food. And when you're negotiating in person, always make sure that the decision maker can see the whole room. So that's where they are more likely to agree to your terms. If they can't see the whole room, they are constantly worried about what might be going on behind their back. And that's what makes them less likely to agree to what you're saying. Oh yeah, guy ahead of the table. The man with the laptop. Great, guys. I only saw the chat now. You were right. Then there's also the danger zone. So the danger zone is basically stuff we want to look out for. When we see that in a person, we want to stop in our tracks and go back to building rapport. At the same time, we also want to not give away any of this danger zone body language cues. So I'm going to show you the most common ones. The most common one is probably distancing. That is when we lean back or when we take a step back. We do distancing, we physically distance ourselves because we emotionally distance ourselves. So when you see someone taking a step back or leaning back, make sure you pause and you check in with them and you build rapport. Then we also have self-comforting gestures. One of the most common ones is people biting their nails or having their hands near their face. If you see that, then you just know that the other person is not feeling 100% confident and comfortable. Something that I find quite interesting that is a bit more subtle than biting your nails is when we touch this spot here. So in between your collarbones, you can feel a spot, a soft spot. And that's when we press here, we release quite a few hormones that help us relax. And that's why when we are stressed, when we are nervous, we tend to play with our necklaces. We tend to adjust our ties, adjust the collar, just because we comfort ourselves by touching this area here. Now, you don't want to do that as the salesperson because while consciously we won't recognize that this is an insecure gesture, subconsciously our brains will pick up on it. So as you're selling, make sure that you don't touch this area here. If you see someone else touching their collarbone area, then make sure that you check in with them because there is something going on. Something else that I find quite funny, I have to admit, is the fact that when we lie, our nose heats up. And that's why the tip of our nose gets itchy. So when we touch our nose, we signal to the other person, I can't be trusted. Again, it's subconsciously. We don't even have to consciously notice that the person is doing that, but it makes us feel lower trust towards the other person. So try to not touch your nose as you're in a sales cycle, as you're leading people. And then there's one more, and that is the eye squint. And I'm sure all of us have seen that before. All of us have done that before. If you see that, I want you to stop in your tracks and to ask if there are any questions, because I can guarantee you there will be questions. Now, I already touched about the importance of body language in an online world. Now, most of us, or many of us, work in a hybrid work model. We have a lot of online meetings on Zoom or any other meeting tool. And the reason why we still have to be very aware of our body language is because we can still, for example, help the other person to produce oxytocin and feel more connected to us. How? We do that by looking at the camera. So studies show that, for example, if I'm looking at the camera, you feel like I'm looking at you, your brain produces oxytocin, and you will feel more connected to me. That's why, for example, in a sales environment, if you have notes, make sure you have them close to the camera and you look at the camera every now and then. If you have a second screen, make sure you turn to the camera every now and then, because you want the other person to feel connected with you. So that means camera on at all times. I leave very little room for excuses there. When I work with people, I always want the camera on. Our sales team always has the camera on, because it really helps you to build rapport. It will lead to higher engagement, and it will lead to a better outcome in the sales cycle. Number 2 is the background. Now, fun fact again, when we have plants in our background, we seem more trustworthy. Studies show that. You can see here in our office, we take this quite seriously. We even have plant wallpaper. But the good thing is that applies to virtual backgrounds and to real life. So if you don't have a nice background at home in your office, feel free to use a virtual background. Statistically, it won't make much of a difference. And if you have a nice virtual background, it's still better than have a really messy real background, because backgrounds are basically like first impressions. The light, interesting one. So especially as it's getting darker sooner, a lot of us find themselves in a really dark room, or even the opposite. If you're facing a window, then it's also bad, because you have too much light and people can just see a silhouette and not your face. So we want to make sure that the light is okay, so people can actually see our face, our features. Again, that goes back to building trust and building rapport. And then we have number 4, which is the distance to the camera. The reason why this is so important is because, let's think about it in real life. When we meet someone and we are not that close to them, like in a sales cycle, we're not friends with our prospects, let's face it. We are usually keeping a distance. And then as the relationship gets better, we get closer and closer. It's, again, something we do subconsciously. But this is also the reason why Zoom fatigue exists, because when we have online meetings, we're getting too close too quickly, and our brains get very confused, because I'm just seeing you for the very first time, yet you're already in my personal space. So that's why we want to make sure we keep a good distance to the camera and that our upper body is visible. Again, that goes back to us showing our hands to signal I can be trusted. So pay attention to those 4 things in particular. And a very important note I want to add here, because if you're like me, you have looked at your own self-image in online meetings before. Something I want to add here is, don't stress too much about your appearance. So studies show that people rate themselves less attractive when they're on camera. And another survey showed that 30% of people in online meetings spend half the meeting looking at themselves, 50% of the meeting time. That's a lot. So if you're one of those people, first, zero judgment, totally understandable. But we also want to make sure we don't do that, because if we look at ourselves, we're not looking at the camera. So something that can really help with this is to turn off the self-image. You can do that in the settings, or if you can't find the settings, if you're using a tool that is not allowing that, then you can just put a Post-it on top of your face so you can't see your actual face. It sounds so simple. It will make a huge difference. Another trap that most of us have stepped into, myself included, is the I wait until everyone's here trap. Now, why is this? Oh, first, can you just say yes in the chat if you have used that sentence before? You join a meeting, you see that not all meeting attendees are already there. So you say, I wait until everyone's here. Who has said that before? Well, if you're anything like me, you probably have said it before, like most of the other people as well. The thing is, we don't want to use this sentence. Why? We don't want to use this sentence because when we jump into a meeting and we say, we'll wait until everyone is here, what we are basically doing is we are inviting people to get distracted. And once someone is distracted, it's very difficult to get their attention back. So ideally, we want to keep people engaged. We want to keep the conversation going. And that's why even asking, hey, how are you? How's your day been? Is better than saying, I'll wait until everyone's here. So from now on, I would challenge you to never use that sentence again. Then, as I promised, there is a third section to our session today, and that is all about becoming a leader. Now, I already said leadership skills are something that apply to situations outside of managing people as well. And I really want to stress that because, in my opinion, you should become a leader long before you become a people manager. Leadership skills are really all about how you show up, what you stand for, knowing your values. And I'm going to give you an exercise at the end of it, but I first want to talk about a few leadership rules that we want to keep in mind. So first things first, communication is key when it comes to really being an influential leader. And that also links to one of our first slides where we talked about listening skills. So there are 5 rules of communication. And I would challenge you to really keep them in mind whenever you talk, because if you follow those 5 rules, you will become a way better communicator. The first rule is knowing your why. So before you open your mouth, before you start talking, know why you're talking. That is so important. And I can guarantee you, if you don't know why you're talking, the people listening won't know why you're talking either. So you need to know your why in order to be able to communicate your why to other people. Rule number 2 is communicate emotions in person. Especially as you're moving towards leadership, it's very likely that you will have difficult conversations at some point. When we have difficult conversations, it's very likely that other people will have an emotional reaction to it. It's very human. What we don't want to do is we don't want to leave them to fend for themselves. What we do want to do is we want to help them process their emotions accordingly. So when you have a conversation, maybe you put someone on a performance improvement plan, you want to be there in the moment to help them process those emotions. If we don't do that, we risk that the person walks away and they still have to process the emotion. There's no way around it. We are all human. But if they are left to process the emotion on their own, it might be that they turn to other people, that rumors start, the people talking behind people's back. And it's not always that people have bad intentions. It's just that people really need to process their emotions. So be the leader, be there to help them. When it comes to communicating facts, however, feel free to do so in an email. It's actually quite beneficial because then you can always go back and check that email. Rule number 4, listen more than you talk. This does not apply to this situation right now when you do a presentation or a training, for example, but when you are actually having a conversation with people, make sure that you spend more time listening than talking. If you're using tools like Gong or Jiminy, you even have the ability to see analytics, to see how much time you spend talking. I think this is great because if we really want to understand other people, we should not be the ones talking. And rule number 5, keep it simple. There's very little value added to using big words. It's more important that you keep the message simple so you avoid confusion and you avoid misunderstandings. So keep it simple to make sure that everyone understands what you're saying, especially if you have people with different roles in the group, if you have people with different specializations like finance people, marketing people from different departments in the group. And then I want to talk to you about the 14 areas of impact. And that's also where our exercise comes in. So there are 14 areas. If you nail them, then you're really great at having an impact on other people. I'm going to walk you through all of those 14 areas now, and then I'm going to give you an exercise to take away. So the first area is communication. So to be really able to create a compelling message and communicate the goal very, very clearly. Number 2 is the vision. So are you really able to create an what's in it for them vision? And again, going back to communication, communicate that effectively. Number 3 is the plan. So to really be able to outline a plan, a roadmap, then get feedback and adjust that plan and then get the buy-in. So it's not just about telling people what to do. It's about planning and creating that roadmap in the right way. Clarifying roles. So as you grow into a leader, it's very important that you're able to tell people or clarify roles to people, clarify responsibilities. Empowering others. So that means delegating to others and really agree on what they're supposed to do and then let them do that. I cannot stress enough how important the second part of the sentence is, because especially when we transition into that first-time manager role, we sometimes have the tendency to control other people because we are so used that we can do everything ourselves. And suddenly, as we manage people, we can't do everything ourselves anymore. And side fact, we can't control other people either. Micromanaging never works. So as you delegate, make sure that you give them what they need to do the job properly and then let them do the job. Number 6 is promoting creativity and innovation. So to challenge people to think outside the box. We also want to nurture synergy. So we want the people to, our team to work together as a team and not to have that toxic competitive side to it. And just to add on that, competition can be great, but I would just want to make sure that we differentiate between healthy competition and toxic competition. Role modeling, the core of leadership, really. And I would even go so far and say that probably one of the most difficult things to do is role modeling. So to do everything you ask others to do. Monitoring progress, very important. We want to be able to establish an accountability system. It's not just about you holding other people accountable. It's also about creating a system where people can hold themselves accountable. Then having an open door policy. It's quite self-explanatory, but it's also about continuously listening for the feedback, updating roles and responsibilities and the vision of the team. Going back to the motivation piece, to keep everyone motivated. Number 11 is resolve. So portray a sense of determination. Then we have attainment, which is all about recognizing milestones and which is also linked to the next one, which is celebrating. It's very important that we reward people for their contribution to the team. And then number 14, being forward thinking. So to really take all the experience you have gathered and to use that in the next project, in the next career step. Now, as I already said, this is also an exercise here. And so here you have all 14 areas of impact. And what you can do after our session today is you can walk away, have a look at the slide, and then rate yourself and rate the importance of each one of those areas. So go through this. There's low, there's medium, and there's high. So L, M, H. First, go through those 14 areas and rate your current ability. So low, medium, high. How am I doing on communication? I think my ability of being a great communicator is really high, so I put an H there. Then, after you have been through all 14 of those categories or areas, then you do the same again, but now you rank them based on importance to you. So that is very subjective, but that also helps us see to really, or helps us see where we want to progress, where we want to do some work. So, for example, if I rate myself really low on vision, but it's actually of high importance, then that's an area I want to work on. if I rate myself medium when it comes to clarifying roles, but I also think it's of medium importance, well, probably not my focus for now. That can change in the future. And that's it. So I hope this has helped you. And I also wanted to leave some time if you have any questions. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask them.
Thank you, Anna. There was some great frameworks that we can pull on for the different phases of communication, listening, body language, and then also leadership. So I think tomorrow, so we have our peer groups called tomorrow, and we discuss kind of our key learnings from the masterclass, which is great. I was just wondering, kind of, you know, when you enter a physical meeting, like, what do you pay attention to first when you get into that room? You know, how like, what's the first thing that's just going on in your mind when you're into a new room of meeting? I'm just curious on how you approach that.
Really good question. So there's two sides to it. First, I want to scan the room. So I want to just pay attention to where everyone is seated, the seating order. Also in terms of hierarchy, where is the decision maker, but I also want to pay a lot of attention towards my own body language. So when I enter a room, I want to make sure first, I want to have good posture. I want to make sure my shoulders are back, my torso is open, also because that helps with your voice. If you ever find yourself struggling with a shaky voice, chances are that your shoulders are forward and not backwards, and that's why your torso is closed, and that's why you can't use the full volume of your voice. So I want to make sure my own posture is great. I also, if possible, in the setting, I want to make sure I'm shaking people's hands. Physical touch, very powerful. I want to create eye contact, and I also want to smile at them, but a genuine smile. So not that fake, hey, it's not reaching my eyes smile. I want to give them the best experience. I want to show them that I'm excited to see them.
Do you ever, you know, if you're managing the meeting, do you ever kind of allocate the seats? So like, hey, Kate, you sit here, or like, how much can you control if you're kind of trying to influence the room on like where people end up sitting?
Yeah, it depends. So if you're inviting someone to a meeting and they come into your space, then you can just, for example, the way you position the chairs can already help. If you don't want someone to sit in that space, just take away the chair. You can lead people towards the place where you want them to sit. So you have a lot more control when you are actually the person organizing the meeting. When you come to a company and you enter their meeting space, you have way less power over those factors. But what you can still do is you can still make sure that when you adjust your chair, you make sure that you are in a position where you can keep eye contact. And something we can always control is where our torso is facing. So even if I'm sitting on the long side of a table, I still want to make sure that my torso is facing the person I'm talking to. I don't want to just turn my head. That is really bad in terms of building rapport. So there's those small things that we can control. In general, if you have a round table, there's a lot more inclusion, and it's way more likely that you have high engagement on a round table rather than a rectangular or square table.
Great, interesting, awesome. Well, thank you. Like there was so a lot of nuggets there that I think are going to come up in discussion tomorrow, and also we can watch this back as new people join as well. So appreciate your efforts, Anna, and also we'll keep you in the loop of our upcoming events, because as someone that's contributed, you'll always be welcome to come along at no charge, obviously. So thanks very much for today.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me.
Great. Have a great day. Cheers, Anna.
Bye.
Bye.